Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. Houston is joining dozens of other American cities and counties, including Stockton, California, Birmingham, Alabama, Louisville, Kentucky, and Nashville, Tennessee, that are experimenting with guaranteed income programs amid growing wealth inequality in the U.S. The programs are part of a trend at the local and national level toward providing direct, largely unconditional payments to Americans for everything from pandemic relief to child assistance. They reflect a growing sentiment among economists, tech industry leaders, and Democrats that distributing money without strings is one of the most effective and least bureaucratic ways to help struggling Americans. Walter, news or faux news?
News. It's good news and bad news. Good news is I actually do think that, one of the good things government is actually really good at is giving money away. So you look at a program like Social Security, and while, there are all kinds of questions about the long-term financial health of the system and so on, it's pretty clear that when it comes to just passing out checks to tens of millions of people, the government seems to do that at a reasonable cost and at a reasonable reliability. So I get that. And I also think the implicit criticism of bureaucratic programs that are designed to help the poor by modifying their behavior or tweaking them to do this or that. Those things are, I think, both ineffective and, generally speaking, administered in a pretty clumsy and ineffective way. So trying to, where it is necessary and appropriate for government to support people, doing that in a way that is as administratively simple and as unmanipulative as possible does make sense. However, if you think of the broader question, is what do we need to do as automation progresses and as, we're sort of thinking about jobs in different ways, that we need to have a sort of increasingly large underclass that is permanently on the dole. That's the most terrible idea you could possibly have. It's unbelievably destructive to the recipients. I think it will, over time, contribute and accelerate the sort of dissolution of our democratic culture. It's really bad. You have to ask yourself, is it better for the American people to learn how to solve their own problems by by figuring out ways to get other people to voluntarily give them money? Or is it better to have big government taking money from X and giving it to Y forever? Now, obviously, you've got situations where people need and deserve help. People with health problems and they cannot work. People with, there are real problems. A factory has closed in a city and there aren't any other jobs. And so these, they're things we do need to do. But anything that envisages the development of a permanent parasitical underclass it's wrong, and more for the people who'll be getting the money actually than the people who are having the money taken out of their pockets.
Yeah, one thing I've been curious about that, is there a kind of first mover advantage with UBI where, like, once the policy's out there, it's kind of not possible to make a politically salient argument against it or to take it away, right? Because then you're basically arguing against the very efficient distribution of money to people who might need it.
Yeah, I think there's an underlying pessimism about how the information revolution is going to transform the job market that I think is at work here. That people say, well, everybody used to work for GM in a factory. Now, even if we have rampant protectionism and subsidies and all of that, manufacturers are just not going to employ as many people because we'll have robots and we'll automate processes. So, does this mean that 40% of the population is going to be economically useless and needs to be sort of, put on the dole? Soylent Green and government cheese and whatever else you're going to get. If that's is that our future? I just don't think it is or should be. When the Industrial Revolution came and we were going from over 50% of the country working in agriculture to now less than 2%, we didn't. A lot of people would say in the 1850s and 60s, well, what will they do if they're not working on farms? They're all going to starve. Catastrophe is coming. Now, a few really smart people might have predicted, okay, someday there's going to be horseless carriages and people will work in factories making horseless carriages. And if some people might have even guessed, I think I wrote about this in American Interest, some people might have even guessed there'll be flying machines and people will be getting jobs, in factories making the flying machines. But we know what they would not have guessed and could not have guessed is that there are going to be people making a really nice living writing letters saying that your pet is an emotional support animal so that it can sit beside you in the flying machine. As we look at this future where inevitably a lot of the manufactured goods and agricultural goods that used to consume most of the world's labor to produce them that labor is no longer required, it's going to be releasing people not from the need to work, I think, but it's going to make us working for people. There will be more wedding planners, more dietitians, more all kinds of ways in which we're going to have a more people-focused economy. And rather than sort of consigning vast swaths of the population to a permanent degrading, dehumanizing, and by the way, impoverishing, ultimately dull, what we really need to be doing is thinking about how do we create the conditions where these new jobs can be invented and new industries based on the new technology can form.
All right, our second story. It's not just merchant ships being targeted by the Houthis in the Red Sea, according to the BBC. The U.S. carrier strike group trying to protect them has also been under constant threat too. The commander of the carrier group, Captain Chad Rowe, lists the threats they've been facing over the past 4 months as anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned surface vessels, and now unmanned underwater vessels, all loaded with explosives. Captain Rowe says the Houthis have posed the greatest challenge to the U.S. Navy in recent history, says Captain Rowe. Quote, "This is the most since World War II." Walter, the Houthis is the biggest threat to the U.S. Navy since Imperial Japan. Is that news or faux news?
Well, it does say the Soviet Union was not very successful when it came to the Navy. But look, I think it's terrible news, and it's real news. The fact is, Iran is winning its war to conquer the Middle East, and the Middle East remains an absolutely key economic and political theater for the world. It means the United States is standing helpless and paralyzed by a bunch of people who, not that long ago were kind of undertrained, under-equipped, under-organized, sort of random militias running around in Yemen, who have now, thanks to Iranian help, become a forceful, formidable force, as Hezbollah has done. No effective response from the United States. You cannot ask for a clearer sign of failing American strategy and failing and declining American political competence than to see one of the world's vital waterways being closed by actions of really a very, very minor group. This is absolutely, again, if our country were in good shape at the moment, there would be a bipartisan consensus that this is radically unhealthy and steps need to be taken to change the situation.
All right, final story of the week. From public safety to schools, New Yorkers across all 5 boroughs feel that their city's quality of life has worsened significantly over the last decade. Only half of New Yorkers plan to stay in the city, according to a survey of more than 6,600 New York City households conducted in the second half of 2023 by the nonpartisan Citizens Budget Commission. Only 39% are content with the state of public education, only 37% are happy with the level of public safety in their neighborhood, and only 34% are satisfied with their neighborhood's cleanliness. Less than a third rate the city's quality of life as excellent or good, and less than a quarter are content with the overall quality of government services. And in nearly every category, Walter, New Yorkers felt worse about the city in 2023 than they did in 2017 and in 2008. Is this news or faux news?
Well, it must be fake news, Jeremy, because New York City is spending much, much more on its bureaucracy, on its teachers. It's spending enormous amounts of money. How could they possibly not be happy? Remember, I used to live in New York, and I love New York, although there were times I found New York very frustrating. The whole rats on subway things, in subway cars things, every now and then was a little kind of disturbing early in the morning. And I remember I had a friend in Queens who said, we don't call those rats out where I live. We call them track rabbits. So, there are always a few little problems in New York, but what we're seeing is an unsustainable sort of thing of public services in decline, public revenues in decline. As with the revolution in working from home, commercial real estate is less valuable, and more commuters are spending less time in the city, meaning not only that that there's less tax revenue associated with it, but also that there's less economic activity. Fewer people are getting lunch downtown, which is bad news for people who have jobs providing lunches to people who live downtown. So there's a constant erosion of the foundations of the contemporary city. That is what we're looking at. And interestingly, it does point to, and I'm going to be doing some writing about this, I think it points to some of the new politics we're going to be looking at, where we have all of these cities. I mean, Chicago was in worse shape than New York, and by almost any indication. We're going to have all of these hungry blue cities that cannot go on without enormous and ever increasing subsidies from either the states in which they're situated, or very often the federal government. Well, there are going to be a lot of taxpayers who don't live in those cities, who don't want to pay to bail them out, and especially won't want to pay to bail them out when the cities are doubling down on some of the policies and cost structures that make it so expensive to work there. So it's a real car crash in American politics. On balance, it looks as if it's one that will help the Republicans and hurt the Democrats, because going to put Democrats in the position of constantly saying more, more, more to benefit, effectively speaking, a minority of the population, calling on the majority to subsidize the minority. That's usually not a great place to be in politics.
Yeah, in a future episode, we're going to talk about cities in general. But for now, I just want to ask, why are cities something that Americans seem to be kind of particularly bad at least compared with the other OECD countries? Is there a kind of historical reason there?
I don't know that we're necessarily so bad at them. And what the historical comparison is. I mean, you can look at a city like Paris and say, oh my goodness, downtown Paris is so nice compared to some American cities. Well, downtown Paris is actually one of the nicest places in the world. And I think we all enjoy having to spend time there. And I, for one, by the way, am prepared to spend as much time in Paris as it takes to keep U.S.-French relations on an even keel in an increasingly stormy world. You can count on me for this, Jeremy. But then you look at the suburbs in Paris, and they are not so nice. It's, then this is part of the pattern. In America, what often happened was that the money went to the suburbs and the poverty stayed in the cities. In a lot of European cities, these beautiful traditional city centers just look lovely. But in fact, the real business of the city, and often many of the people who the poorer people in the city live outside in places that are actually nastier in many ways than some of our inner city areas. Now, there are, I think, elements where crime has been and remains a somewhat bigger problem in the U.S. than in some European cities. But if you compare us apples to apples, compare us with other cities in the Americas, New York and Chicago and Los Angeles don't look that bad compared to, well, right now, I guess in San Salvador and El Salvador, they're doing all right, but at a price I'm not sure we want to pay.
Mm-hmm.
But you compare them to, what's been going on, say, in Bogota or Rio or even Buenos Aires. Our cities actually, in the Americas, there actually are levels of crime and violence endemic. Canada's not really part of the Americas, maybe we can say, but from the U.S. Canada border down to Tierra del Fuego. So we compare ourselves to Europe and we say, why aren't we more like Europe? The answer is because we're not European. But yes, I think our cities are potentially could work a lot better than they do. And hopefully we're going to see some changes. But right now we're locked into some patterns that are making things worse.
All right, that does it for this week's news. Let's have the big conversation. So on Wednesday, Walter, 19 Democratic senators sent a letter to Joe Biden urging him to take bold diplomatic action and publicly outline a path for the United States to recognize a non-militarized Palestinian state. And the senators urged that this new state be governed by a, quote, reformed and revitalized Palestinian Authority. Now, we've heard that phrasing a lot by now, but the interesting thing this time was that the letter coincided with the release of new public opinion polling from the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is based in Ramallah, and which surveys Palestinians living in both Gaza and the West Bank. And it showed that the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, has about 11 to 13% support in Gaza and 19 to 20% support among Palestinians overall, whereas Hamas, by contrast, has 52% support in Gaza and 64% in the West Bank. So, in a word, the PA trails Hamas by 31% in Gaza and 46% overall among Palestinians. And finally, the specific plan for a reformed and revitalized PA backed by a U.S. Arab coalition is apparently opposed by 73% of Palestinians. So, Walter, you're neither a Democratic senator nor a resident of the Palestinian territories, so I figured you might have the right distance and sense of history and proportion to maybe give us a better sense of what a Palestinian state might actually look like. We've talked a lot since October 7th about Israel and Zionism and U.S. diplomacy, but I think our listeners might be interested to learn about, what conditions would it actually take to get to a Palestinian state? What might that state look like? Who or what aspirations would it serve? And I guess, what do you think the prospects for achieving it actually are?
We should probably start at the end there with the prospects. I think, I think when people ask, want to recognize a Palestinian state, and some governments do recognize the PA as a Palestinian state, it's kind of a confusion, because the word recognize a state means that another government realizes that this group of people is a state in control of a piece of territory. And so they recognize, okay, you're the government of France. No one else is, it's you, Monsieur Macron. And if you're overthrown by somebody else, that we will, in due course, recognize them as the government of France, because that's how it works. This is more to pretend that something is a Palestinian state that isn't a Palestinian state. And the PA is not a state. It is not in control of its own territory. It's not in control of its own money. There are a lot of things that it has some state attributes, but it is lacking in others. And in fact, some of the same people who talk about wanting to recognize a Palestinian state will simultaneously talk about, we've got to end the Israeli occupation. Well, if you're under an occupation, you're not really a state in control of your territory. So people then kind of come down to what we want to do is to kind of wave a magic wand of some kind. Poof, you're a state. Now we recognize you. And here, what we've seen, I think what we see is after October 7th, two things happen. One is it became much, much harder to imagine a Palestinian state that actually exists. October said, let's not forget, Hamas hates the idea of a Palestinian state and of a two-state solution. It doesn't believe in Palestine as a nation, and it doesn't believe in a territorial compromise with Israel under any circumstances, or a real one. So the fact that the attacks of October 7th kind of blew the possibility of a genuine two-state solution out of the water for a significant period of time is not for Hamas a sign of defeat. It's a sign of success for its political strategy, right? At the same time, people outside, including the Arabs, including the United States, including the Europeans and many others, want a two-state solution, basically because it makes our lives easier. If the Palestinians and the Israelis could agree on boundaries, could agree on the terms, then like all of this awful noise and bombing and killing, all that would stop. We could get back to business. The Arabs could do business with the Israelis, which is very important to the Saudis and the Emiratis and some others. We would stop getting yelled at in the U.S. by everybody who's mad at Israel and says it's all our fault. Things would just get nicer, and we want it. And frankly, as Americans, we don't really care that much, is the boundary on the top of this hill or on the top of that hill, or, what's in clause 17C of the agreement. We just want them to agree, and we really don't care what they agree on. Just agree, darn it. Again, we are like parents in the front seat of the car, turning back to the kids. I don't care who started it. I want you to both stop it now and be quiet. Is what we want, right? So we want that more after October 7, but it is much, much harder to get. That's what's happening. And in a sense, I think the Hamas people are quite happy that that's what's happening. Iran is thrilled that this is what's happening. This is what they hoped would happen. Now, how do you sort of get somewhere with that? The answer does lie in a reformed and restructured Palestinian Authority. And I have to say, I've heard those words from very, very senior Israeli officials, as well as from very, very left-wing American Democrats, which tells you, those words may not, those are some of those wonderful words that sound like they mean something very specific, but in fact could mean almost anything. This is a very common tool in diplomacy, is the use of this kind of language. Look, within that word salad that people use to describe what, reformed, restructured, revitalized, whatever Palestinian entity might be, I think something like that is still, the way to go, but it's going to be kind of long term. The Israelis, quite rationally, at the moment, do not trust the Palestinians. And the Palestinians at the moment are really pretty annoyed with the Israelis and do not trust their intentions either. And both sides have good reasons for what they think. Again, we Americans think, they should all agree and they should learn to trust each other, and the moderates should get together and repress the extremists. We're trying to do that in this country right now without a lot of notable success. So we have to think about, this will take time, and I think you're going to first get an administration that works, and it will hopefully acquire popularity and legitimacy because it works. I think you're less likely to start off by trying to get something that is popular and then enable it to work. And this is where, with Arab money and backing, and with some real serious technocrats in there, determined to kind of make things work better. I would like to see them get rid of UNRWA completely. but provide the services that UNRWA provides through a more effective and efficient organization. So, beginning to build a better situation, a better administration. And then as you make progress with that, you find people say, at first I didn't really want this, but now I'm looking at it as not so bad. Then you might gradually get to a point where on both the Palestinian and Israeli sides, some sort of real compromise starts to make sense. Now, what is, I think, frustrating for people on the Palestinian side of this is that the Israelis, especially this current government, are not going to just sort of sit passively during the 20 or 30 years that it might take, or let's be optimists, 8 years that it might take for this thing to take hold and work. But you're going to see settlements expanding. You're going to see deliberate Israeli government policy to put more Israelis on the West Bank to lock up certain resources. So while the Palestinians are sort of, paralyzed by the need to deal with some of these internal things, the Israelis are going to be cementing their control and rewriting the map to their own satisfaction. That's a legitimate concern that people have, but it is not something, but it's real. It's not something that you can just wish away. And is it likely that the U.S. or the Europeans are ready to pile on Israel in some of the ways that you would need to do to block that from happening? My own thought is it probably enough for some limits, but not enough, not as much as the Palestinians would like to see. So it's not a good situation. It's not necessary. And by the way, then that in itself further radicalizes and alienates Palestinian opinion or makes it hard for this new administration to say, look how effective we are. I have said before that what the Palestinians need is not Nelson Mandela, who sort of, it kind of brings a spirit of compromise with victory. They need more a Konrad Adenauer, who finds a way forward to dignity and national success through the acceptance of a massive defeat. And that leadership is the leadership that at least, and I'm an outsider and what do I know? And the Palestinians certainly have a right to figure out their own future. But just looking at it from the outside, that's who I want to see, is the Palestinian Konrad Adenauer who gets that the Palestinians have lost this 100-year war with Zionism, but that's not the end of the Palestinian people, that the ideologies of resistance and so on that led to 100 years of defeat and frustration are not the ideologies that can lead, the ideas that can lead the Palestinians to a better future. But you need to start by, I mean, historian John Dower used this phrase vis-a-vis Japan, embracing defeat, building on it, because there is a lot you could do. And in fact, that is, I think, the as I see it, it offers the greatest hope for the best future for the most Palestinians, and nothing else would do as much. But again, there's nothing more sort of useless and maybe to a certain extent irritating than to have, someone else giving you advice like, oh, just come on, accept defeat, move on. But that's how I see it.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter, this time from Hayden in Las Vegas, who wants to know your favorite city you've lived in or spent significant time in.
Now, that's really hard because, I'm actually more of a serial monogamist for cities than I am a lifelong monogamist. I really, there are a lot of cities that I just love. Maybe my first my first real experience with a big city was when I was 11 years old, and my family moved to the outskirts of London for a year, where my dad switched churches with a priest in the Church of England. And on Saturdays, my mom used to give my brother and me, who's 9, a day tube and bus pass to send us off into the wilds of London together. And so my brother and I went all over London. We got lost. I can't tell you how lost we got sometimes. This story might sound a little Hansel and Gretel-ish to some people. And I'm sure Mom had a nice quiet day as we were off in the wilds of London. But at 11 years old, I came to feel that I could cope with what was then considered the sort of greatest city in the world. And I've never lost that soft spot in my heart for London. I still get lost in London. But I really, it is, Samuel Johnson said, when you're tired of London, you're tired of life. I'm not tired of either one. But, as soon as I say this, but Rome is so amazing, and Paris, and I had so many good years in New York, and, Rio is so beautiful. Buenos Aires is so much fun. Tokyo is so extraordinary. Just Berlin, my goodness. Moscow, I mean, terrible what's happening in Russia now, but Moscow and St. Petersburg are such great cities. So I love cities. I also like the country.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.